We've been talking about the Indo-Europeans, and we've been talking about the Greeks as a branch of the Indo-Europeans. From the Indo-European language group and the Indo-European diaspora idea, we have taken a very long side trip into the Turkish thesis of history. Because it is somewhat connected, in some way connected with the Indo-European hypothesis, so we went into that. Of course, the Indo-European idea itself is much more solidly grounded than the Turkish thesis of history, but I thought it was important in terms of the connection and in terms of an important chapter of the history of modern Turkey in the 1930s, that is to say something associated with what we might call the Kemalist Cultural Revolution. Just one additional comment about that. This comes under what is called in scholarship myths of originism and autochthonism. I should write that. Myths of originism and autochthonism. İlklik ve otochtonluk efsaneleri. It might be translated like that. The second word is difficult, so like that. Myths of originism and autochthons. Autochthonous peoples are said to be the oldest people or peoples in a given locality, in a given region, in a given geography. That is to say, they seem to be there, or they are accepted as having been there from time immemorial. The point is that scholarship seems unable to point to any earlier people. There might have been, but we don't know. So strictly, in scholarship, this is the meaning of autochthonous. In the 19th and 20th century struggles between rival and competitive nationalisms, there arise various ways of arguing that this land, or that land, whatever, should belong to us and nobody else, whoever we might be and whoever the others might be. So this is, if we look at the 19th and early 20th century Balkans, or maybe even today, basically, there are two ways of pressing this argument. One is based on demography. Ethno-linguistically speaking, who is in the majority here? In this part of the Balkans, or that part of the Balkans, or another part of the Balkans, or in Anatolia, Western Anatolia, Northern Anatolia, Eastern Anatolia, whatever. Who is in the majority? Is it Muslim Turks, or Bulgarians, or Greeks, or Serbians, or to the east? Is it Kurds, or Armenians, or Muslim Turks, or maybe Circassians, Cherkesler, whatever? First, there are these arguments about who is in the majority, and the implication is, if such a group are in the majority, that land should be given to them. How do you ascertain this? Maybe by referendum, maybe by a popular vote. The problem is, well, there are many problems with this, but at least one major problem is, what area or what unit are you taking in order to conduct a referendum? It may be that there's a certain area in which Bulgarians are in the majority, but within that area, there's a smaller area in which Greeks are in the majority. And within that, there might be an area in which Muslim Turks are in the majority. But very frequently what happens is, depending on the existing international power relations, it is decided that there should be a referendum in some kind of big area, and whoever is in the majority, it is given to them. Or an attempt is made to give it to them. And what happens is, this places the next group, and the next group under that, and the next group under that in great danger. A second type of argument is resorting to history. And this is where myths of originism and autochthonism come in. The resort to history usually goes like this. Who was here first? Who did this area, this geography belong to in the past? Who came first? Who came later? If not, there is a second argument. These are all connected, but under whose rule, under whose power did this geography that we are talking about live through its most brilliant period? When did it have its greatest civilization? So, very simply, take 20th century Greek nationalism and Turkish nationalism, and the contest, the struggle over Asia Minor, over Anatolia. One argument about demography in Western Anatolia, and demography along the Black Sea coastline, where there are very sizable Greek populations before 1923. So the argument of Greek irredentism, have you encountered the term irredentism before? I'm already slipping into my second semester course, Nations and Languages. Irredentism. Irredenta is an Italian word. The etymology is Italian. It means those unredeemed, kurtarılmamışlar. Kurtarılmamışlar, kucaklanmamışlar, it means something like that. In the 1860s, 1866 basically, Italy achieved its national unification. That is to say, there now emerged a united Italy, a single united Italy, For a time, Rome, the city of Rome, the seat of the papacy, was not integrated with it. This problem was also solved in 1870. So United Italy emerged, but there were Italians, meaning Italian-speaking population groups, left outside. In further north of the Adriatic, here and there under Austrian rule, or as parts of southern France. In the terminology of Italian nationalism, these came to be called irredenta. That is to say, our people who we have not been able to liberate, whom we have not been able to redeem. Okay? So from this, there arose the ideology and the practice of what came to be called irredentism, meaning wanting to unite with the irredenta, those left outside. So the Turkish terminology, the closest thing in Turkish vocabulary for this, in the vocabulary of Turkish nationalists, is dış Türkler or soydaşlarımız. Soydaşlarımız, not vatandaşlarımız, not our citizens, but people of us who are not our citizens. Okay, that is the meaning of soydaşlarımız. Those who are ethnically ours and should be with us. So irredentism, when you have Greeks and Greeks left outside at a certain point, or Italians and Italy and Italians left outside, Greece and Greeks left outside, Turks and Turkey and Turks left outside, Germany and Germans left outside, Russia and Slavs left outside, Iraq and Arabs left outside. I mean, one of the relatively recent examples, why did Saddam Hussein, on what basis did Saddam try to invade Kuwait? On irredentistic grounds. That is to say, this is all the Arab nation, and it should all be us, he argued. So, there is, back to nationalistic arguments about which place should belong to who. There can be demographic and ethnic linguistic arguments, and there can be historical arguments about who came first, and there can also be historical arguments about under whom did this area, this geography live through its greatest period. I was talking about Greek nationalism versus Turkish nationalism. The Greek nationalist argument, the first argument, demography, ethno-linguistics, sizable Greek populations in Western Anatolia and Northeastern Anatolia. Obviously, these areas should be ours because these are Greek irredenta. When I say ours, I'm talking like a Greek nationalist. These are irredenta left outside when the Greek nation state was initially formed. So, I mean, this was the rationale behind the invasion of Western Anatolia, the landings in Izmir, and the growing occupation of parts of Western Anatolia during the Turkish national struggle, 1919-1922. This was called the Greek megali idea, the idea of a greater Greece. But you can encounter it in the life story of many nationalists. The idea of a greater Serbia, the idea of a greater Bulgaria, the idea of a greater Israel, the idea of a greater Iraq, the idea of a greater Syria, and so on and so forth. In 1910, 1911, 1912, on the way to 1912, consider Macedonia. Macedonia was still part of the Ottoman Empire, but it was targeted by three rival nationalisms, three rival greater ideologies. Bulgaria claimed Macedonia, Serbia claimed Macedonia, Greece claimed Macedonia, and it was under Ottoman rule. So what happened was, Greek nationalists inside Macedonia, Bulgarian nationalists inside Macedonia, Serbian nationalists inside Macedonia, they all created their own illegal political parties and their guerrilla forces, their local militias, and they started fighting, not only against Ottoman gendarmerie, but also against each other. Because in order to be able to claim this or that part of Macedonia for themselves, they had to be able to argue to the great powers and to world public opinion that, see, there is nobody else left. So this becomes the ultimate purpose of ethnic cleansing. That's to say, either exterminating a people or driving them out so that the others are no longer there and only we are left, and therefore it becomes a tautological argument that it should belong to us. So on the one hand, Greek nationalism was pursuing this irredentistic policy. On the other hand, there were debates between Greek and Turkish nationalists, including historians, national history on the Greek side and national history on the Turkish side, about the so-called historical questions. History, you might call it pseudo-history. Who was here first? To this, the Greek nationalist answer was clear. Of course, the Greeks. The Greeks in antiquity, and then Greeks in the form of the Byzantine Empire. As I tried to indicate last week, the Turkish nationalist answer to this came in the form of the Turkish thesis of history. No, the Hittites were here before the Greeks, and the Hittites were Turkish. They were a branch of the Turkish people. A further dimension of debate, I'm simplifying enormously, but a further dimension of debate was whose empire was better, Byzantium or the Ottoman Empire? You have two empires arising in virtually the same geography, Byzantium with its Southeast European land, territories, and Anatolian territories, and very similarly for the Ottoman Empire. The Greek nationalist position became something like this. Byzantium was a great and sophisticated civilization, and the Turks were nothing but more like barbarians. They came and they destroyed our Greek civilization. The Turkish nationalist riposte to this became, leave aside the Turkish thesis of history, but the more popular, the more acceptable shall we say, or the mainstream Turkish nationalist response to this eventually became, we the Turks were not only savage barbarians, we created our own great civilization, the Ottoman Empire. To which then, the Greek nationalist response to the response, the rejoinder, became, the Ottoman Empire and Ottoman civilization were not original. They were nothing but an imitation of Byzantium. The Turks did not create an original culture and civilization. They were incapable of doing so. What they did was they simply imitated Byzantine institutions. In 1931, Fuat Köprülü, who is generally regarded as the founder of modern history in Turkey, Fuat Köprülü wrote a very, very long article, a book-length, virtually a book-length article, called Bizans müesseselerinin Osmanlı müesseseleri üzerindeki tesiri üzerine bazı mülahazalar. Some comments on the influence of Byzantine institutions on Ottoman institutions. And it is all about a refutation, or an attempted refutation, of the idea of the Ottoman Empire as nothing but a second copy, an imitation of Byzantium. Okay? I'm not going into the rights and wrongs of this debate. I'm just trying to state the positions so that you can see rival and opposing nationalist ideas. By the way, a quite similar debate raged in Europe in the second half of the 19th century, way into the 20th century, between French and German historians. This is called the debate between the Romanist and the Germanist viewpoints. Romacılar ve Germancılar. What had happened in Europe? We shall be coming to that. In the 4th and 5th centuries, the Roman Empire in the West collapsed under Germanic pressure, the migrations of the peoples, the migrations and invasions of the Germans and the Slavs. And then, after a few centuries of, shall we say, confusion and turbulence, the so-called Dark Ages, Karanlık Çağlar, there took shape a new civilization, medieval civilization. Among medieval historians, let's say, in the 19th century, there arose this question, who had contributed what, or who had contributed how much to the new civilization of the Middle Ages? Rome or the Germans? Basically what happened was, this is what is meant by the Romanist and Germanist views. French nationalist historians became mostly Romanists, pro-Rome, Romacılar, and the German nationalist historians became overwhelmingly Germanists, German, pro-Germans. The arguments were like this. For French nationalist historians, Rome was a great and glorious and sophisticated civilization. The barbaric Germans came in, and they were warlike, they were militaristic, and they destroyed everything. If civilization survived into the Middle Ages, it was because of the legacy of Rome. The very opposite view was held, as you might imagine, by German nationalist historians. Rome was decadent, Rome was corrupt, Rome had become weak, effeminate, degenerate. It was fit that Rome should collapse. In came a new, vigorous, dynamic, heroic, brave people, the Germanic tribes. And the legacy of Rome by itself was impossible to revive, to rehabilitate, or to redeem. It was this dynamic German contribution that decisively led to the formation of the Middle Ages. Have you seen any Cüneyt Arkın films? What are they like? Huh? What about the other side? There are these Byzantine noblemen, aristocrats, who are inevitably weak and decadent and corrupt and effeminate. And there is a Byzantine princess in the middle, and at first she is engaged to this or that Byzantine nobleman, but eventually she falls in love with the heroic Turk, with Cüneyt Arkın. Do you notice the similarity between this and the French-German controversy? It's virtually exactly the same. The Turkish nationalism's idea becomes that Byzantium was weak, effeminate, corrupt, degenerate, all that, and it was fit that the brave, young, dynamic, heroic Turks should overrun it and create a new civilization of their own. And this is the narrative of all those Cüneyt Arkın films, the Kahpe Bizans idea, as it has been satirically referred to. Exactly the same kind of controversy, although not reflected in films like the Cüneyt Arkın films, was going on between pro-Romanist and pro-Germanist historians in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Marc Bloch was really the first major French medievalist to break away from this idea. Açmak mı istiyorsunuz? Açın. Kapatmak mı istiyorsun? Kapat. Sorry. Okay. So eventually, I refer to Marc Bloch. Marc Bloch was the first major French historian to break away from this nationalist polarization. Until Marc Bloch and Lucien Febvre launched their famous periodical called the Annales, until then, German historians would not write in French history journals, French historians would not write in German periodicals. It was totally nationalistically polarized. Eventually, in scholarship, what happened? Well, this was accompanied, of course, by major wars. In 1870, there was the Franco-Prussian War, won by Germany, the German forces organized by Bismarck, Prime Minister. And it led to the creation of the German Empire, the unification of Germany and the creation of the German Empire. And then there was also World War I, during which for a long time on the Western Front took place on French territory. That's to say, there was this trench system running all the way from the Atlantic coastline to the Swiss border, and it was running through northern France. So the war was not taking place on German soil, it was taking place on French soil with terrible casualties and war damage. And you can see how, in the mind of French nationalists, all this went hand in hand with the idea of the Germans as barbarous, warlike, militaristic, destroying, anti-civilizational, etc. What was do you know the British and French nickname for the Germans in World War I? The Huns. Hunlar. That's to say, the ultimate enemy in the eyes of European elites, the ultimate destructive enemy from the outside. Eventually, World War I and then World War II, and eventually peace. Peace and the beginnings of the European Union. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, there was a decisive turning point. There was peace, but France and Germany were still hugely mutually suspicious vis-à-vis each other. Konrad Adenauer, the German Chancellor, Prime Minister, visited France with Charles de Gaulle as president. And there took place a series of talks called the Élysée talks, because they were held at the French presidential palace. And that was the decisive Franco-German rapprochement. They made in it baltaları gömdüler. That's to say, there are various sayings in Turkish, popular sayings, for putting an end to a seemingly endless vendetta or love feud, some kind of kan davası. Baltaları gömdüler denir, atları bağladılar denir. I don't know if you're familiar with these sayings. But it was at the Élysée talks that a decisive Franco-German rapprochement happened. Without that, the European Union would never have happened. Because at the heart of the European Union are France and Germany. The two major powers of continental Europe since the Middle Ages. And they buried the hatchet and they made peace. And this diplomatic rapprochement went hand in hand with significant changes in historiography. I'm not saying that the change in historiography happened simply because of the change in politics, that the one inevitably led to the other. It's more complicated than that. But they happened together in the course of the 20th century. The Romanist view and the Germanist view were replaced by the idea of a Roman-German synthesis, Roma-German synthesis, which is in fact in scholarly terms very justified. It's not just politically expedient. In sheer scholarly terms, it can be argued that this is actually what happened. It has to do with the social and economic formation of medieval Europe. I will not enter into that. In the case of back to Greek and Turkish nationalists, the corresponding, if there had been a corresponding change in historiography and scholarship, it would have been something like a Byzantine Ottoman synthesis or a Greek Turkish synthesis. This has never happened. Why? Let me repeat the question. The scholarly opposition between the Romanist view and the Germanist view, in the case of medieval Europe, has eventually come to be replaced by the much more comprehensive and much better outlook of a Roman-German synthesis. In the case of what happened in Anatolia, we have never had anything like a Greek-Turkish synthesis or a Byzantine Ottoman synthesis. That is to say, there has never been an integration of the idea of two great rival and separate civilizations.
Could this be because of Germany and France were settled mostly in the same place through history? Of course, Napoleon invaded Germany and Germans multiple times invaded France. However, they were not permanent in those areas, I guess. But Greeks, on the other hand, lived under Ottoman territories for centuries, and they were integrated with each other. Their history and culture blended in this century. I guess this might be the reason.
It could be. It could be.
And they claim the same territories because of this.
Yes, that could be. Any other ideas? Well, I will go with this. Sorry. What are you going to say? There is the religious divide. In Europe, what happened was the incoming Germans and Slavs were absorbed into Christianity. So they became part of a generalized medieval Christian civilization. They all became part of Christendom, Christianity. This did not happen. It did not happen between Greeks and Turks. And the idea of one side continuing as Christians and the other side continuing as Muslims, and how religious ideas have fed into Greek nationalism and Turkish nationalism, this has perpetuated a mental polarization, mental and cultural polarization, far deeper than in the case of the Roman Empire versus the Germanic tribes. Do you see what I'm saying? The religious difference, the prevailing religious communalization or congregationalization has made it mentally much more difficult. It is not as if people have thought about this and rejected the idea, but it has made it much more difficult for the idea to arise in the first place, because this compartmentalization continues to this day. I thought that I would just add, I thought I could do it relatively briefly, but it hasn't turned out to be that way. It has turned out to be a rather longish sidetrack. Okay, so the first peoples with names, the Celts, for example, the Celti, first given this name by the Greeks. It was used by the Greeks to refer to large groups of peoples who lived in Europe from the time of Herodotus. They are mentioned in Herodotus. It is unclear what the ancient Greeks meant by this. Did they mean just one tribe, or was it a name given to a general culture? It is unclear to this day. Just who did they mean by the Celts? There are, if you look at this map, there are huge problems in modern scholarship with regard to the Celts and their spread and their culture. So the reddish area is the Celtic area. But what does this mean? Does it mean that as tribes they were there, or does it mean Celtic culture? That's to say, not necessarily associated with the population, not necessarily associated with the movement of the tribes. There is this question of how culture spreads. Does it spread only because the people themselves move, or can it spread, or how much can it spread by trade and commerce and cultural interactions of various sorts? Just a marginal note, scholarship is changing in this regard. It used to be believed that there had to be a diaspora for this or that culture to expand. Current, present-day leading-edge archaeologists are thinking otherwise. They think that the presence of a common Celtic culture in England and parts of Ireland and on the continent, etc., does not necessarily mean that the Celtic tribes moved into all these locations, that material culture might have spread even without the tribes actually moving. I'm just drawing your attention to this problem. Okay. Now, a lot of Greek history. Who are the Greeks, or the Hellenes speaking Hellenica? Perhaps partly repeating what you might remember from SPS 101. They're an Indo-European people. They come into Greece in two stages or two big waves. One, from about 2200 to around 2000 BC, a first wave. And then a second wave, 1,000 years later, from 1100 to 1000 BC. In Turkish textbooks of the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, if you can find them, the first wave are referred to as Akalar, Achaeans. Why? Because in the Iliad and the Odyssey, it is the Achaeans who are fighting the Trojan War. So this is a matter of putting evidence from epic poetry side by side with archaeological evidence about the immigration and concluding that they must correspond, which is plausible, but not necessarily true. I mean, we cannot easily say that because they are mentioned by Homer, because they are mentioned in the oral tradition, in the, let's say, starting from the 12th century, and these poems are eventually put into writing in the 8th century, we cannot simply conclude that these were the new arrivals around the year 2000. It is plausible, but not certain. Current scholarly practice is to call them Mycenaeans, not Achaeans, but Mycenaeans, Mykendiler, on the basis of deeper archaeological evidence. That is to say, we know from archaeology that from around the 18th century BC to around the 12th or the 11th century BC, the culture of ancient Greece was what we call a Middle Bronze Age or Late Bronze Age culture, or Geç Tunç Bronze Çağ kültürü, centered on the archaeological site, the kingdom of Mycenae. So this is probably in scholarly terms more relevant than just calling them Achaeans. About the second wave, we are much more certain. We call them Dorians because we know that this was what they called themselves, and because we know that they arrived around 1100 to 1000. Why? Because now we have written evidence. Because the Dorians came with writing, they already had writing, and we have written evidence of them, of their movements, of their settlements, and so on and so forth. In general, how do we know about the movements themselves? That's to say, the question of who were they apart, were they Achaeans or Mycenaeans, or were they Dorians or not, etc. How do we notice a massive population movement like this around 2000 BC and around 1000 BC? It's based on archaeological findings. And there are basically two principal methods involved. You have, let's say, you have north and south. You have the northern parts of the Balkan Peninsula, and then the Balkan Peninsula narrowing down and coming into present-day Greece. You have a series of spot excavations here and there. And crucially, they can be dated. through radiocarbon and other dating methods. They can be dated quite accurately. So we notice a movement. The earlier ones are further north, and then they seem to be coming down further and further south in chronological terms. And eventually, we arrive in Greece. The common factor is, the decisive factor is, these excavations reveal a common material culture. The same kinds of tools, the same kinds of weapons, the same kinds of artifacts, plus, crucially, the same animal bones. Horses and horse bones and horse skeletons. Until this time, there are no horses in Greece. So you have an animal that is not indigenous to Greece. It's not part of its local fauna. And you have a series of spot excavations, archaeological sites, in which, from early to late, you keep finding horse bones, and finally, they end up in Greece by around the year 2000 or slightly later. Very clearly, around this, you can construct a narrative of migration or invasion and the introduction of horses into Greece. First type of evidence and reasoning. Secondly, what is called a horizon of fire destruction. So, think of your geographical maps of curves of equal temperature or curves of equal atmospheric pressure, what are called isotherms or isobars, etc. Think of curves like that. Let's say in northern Greece, around 2200 BC, you have a series of 6 or 7 archaeological sites which show evidence of having been destroyed by fire at more or less the same time. And you connect them as a curve. And 100 years later, a bit further south, you have another 6 or 7 sites that seem to have suffered fire destruction, again at more or less the same time, and then a third curve, etc. What is this? Clearly you have evidence of a warlike invasion from the north, gradually proceeding north to south. As they come further and further south, they are attacking existing settlements, towns or cities or fortifications, and conquering them, seizing them, and using fire in a process of destruction. So this is the second type of evidence of an invasion taking place from a certain direction into a certain direction, overrunning the entire country involved, in this case, proceeding from north to south. And the third is change in burial customs. Now, burial customs are one thing that human societies are most conservative about. Left to their own devices, if there is a kind of peaceful cultural continuity, people don't change their burial customs. When you have a certain kind of burial custom that can be demonstrated, archaeologically demonstrated, to have existed for a very long time, and then suddenly you have an abrupt change. So, let's say that they used to bury their dead upside down, or they used to bury their dead in a uterine position, that's to say, like the child in its mother's womb. But then suddenly, these are abandoned, and you have the dead buried horizontally. This kind of change, I'm just giving abstract examples, but this kind of change, if it happens quickly and radically, compressed into a certain period of time, it can only be through outside interference, that's to say, a massive invasion or migration of some sort. There are the old people and the old customs, and on top of that, there is coming in a new people with their different burial customs, and this is now what becomes dominant. So, in terms of, how do we know? How is it that we can talk of a first wave of the Greek-speaking peoples coming into present-day Greece, first around 2200 to 2000 years BC, and then around 1100 to 1000 BC, on the basis of these kinds of archaeological evidence, okay? I'm trying to say something about the formation of Greece, and I'm also trying to say something about archaeology. I've already spoken of the next problem. This is simultaneously both formation and construction. Because the Greeks come in, they create a civilization, they create their own civilizational mentality, and they create their patterns of otherization. They start naming the peoples around them. They call some groups Scythians, some others, the Persians, they call them barbarians. They define their own universe and their own neighbors. They create their own Hellenic-centric or Greek-centered kind of viewpoint about the world surrounding them, about other peoples and civilizations around them. So I would like to trace the outlines of Greek history from this point onward in terms of a series of maps. So look, here, around 1850 BC, look at Greece, you see the first wave of Greek-speaking peoples entering from the north and moving south. That's basically what I want you to look at. Note the Italic peoples, the white area, also entering Italy. Again, a branch of the Indo-European peoples. So by 1600, Greece has become Greece, Hellas has become Hellas, basically. You have a sizable and comprehensive and adjacent kind of Greek-speaking population. This is the time of the shaft graves that Schliemann excavated in Mycenae. They date from around this century. I will come to the archaeological story of Schliemann first excavating Troy, and then going to Greece and excavating Mycenae. By the way, note the Iranians, another branch of the Indo-European peoples, entering Iran, entering Persia from the north. Some branches, the Aryans, going into India, and others coming to settle in Persia. So around 1300 BC, this is just slightly before the time of the legendary Trojan War. Another 50 years, and it'll be the Trojan War. Note that the Greeks, or the Greek-speaking peoples, are already moving out of continental Greece and beginning to settle in Western Anatolia and Cyprus. This is the very early beginning of what will come to be called the Greek colonization movement, using the sea to move and to create colonies in adjacent lands. So 1000 BC, the previous wave has been joined now by the Dorians, and the Greek-speaking area is growing. It now covers the entire Aegean basin and a lot of the Eastern Mediterranean. Notice the Western Asia Minor coastline and the Southern Asia Minor coastline, and it has come to be largely Greek-speaking. 825 BC, 175 years later, the Greek colonization area, the Greek settlement area, has been consolidated. I'm not going into the details of what is happening with the Phrygians, the Assyrian Empire, the Kingdom of Egypt, etc. You can follow that by yourselves. I'm just focusing on the Greeks with some remarks simultaneously on what is happening in Italy, because here you can see this white area called the Etruscans, Etrusculaire, and this is on the way to the formation of Rome. Rome will eventually be formed under Etruscan domination or protection, under the Etruscan umbrella. So 650 BC, 670 BC, again, just look at the Greek area. The Greek colonization movement has now implanted itself along the northern coast of Anatolia, all along the northern Aegean, Constantinople, Istanbul, earlier Constantinople, earlier Visas has its beginnings here. And it has also spread to Sicily and the south of Italy, which comes to be called Magna Graecia, Greater Greece, kind of. Magna Graecia, Graecia, Graecia. And even more so, 100 years or so later, because you now have the Greek colonization movement. The Greek colonization movement has spread to the north of the Black Sea, the vicinity of Crimea, and has also extended into the Western Mediterranean. These Greek trading colonies north of the Black Sea, they are the ones that will be in contact with the Scythians in the hinterland, and will give them the name of Scythians after the Greek god of archery. I spoke about all this last year in SPS 101. But note the Median Empire, Medler, the Med Imperatorluğu, arising in Iran, arising in the homeland of the Medes around here, and becoming a great empire that begins to enter Anatolia. 10 years later, 10 years after the approximate time of this map, the Medians will be overthrown by the Persian Achaemenid dynasty, and this will give rise to the Persian Empire, which will go much further than the Medians, will overrun all of Anatolia, and this will bring it into contact with the Greek city-states. Okay. Look at this map before that. The Phoenician colonization and the Greek colonization, two seafaring peoples. The Phoenicians from their original location in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the Levant, and the reddish coastal zones indicate the spread of colonization from Phoenicia, most crucially, Carthage, around here. And all the Greek green areas refer to the Greek colonization movement. What is this all about? There are these Greek city-states, and they are sending out boatloads of people who are settling here and there all over the Mediterranean, and who maintain their allegiance, more or less, to the mother city, to the metropolis, and create a loose network in alliance with that mother state. But this is how the two colonization movements are taking shape. So, what happens next? Did you go to the archaeological museums last year? Mm-hmm. Do you remember that? The various stages there? Now we are taking an excursion into ancient Greek history. There is something called the Archaic Age, and there is something called the Classical Age. All this is after the second wave, that's to say the Dorian invasions or migrations. The Dorians come in. They settle. Greece is a very mountainous country. Have any of you been to Greece? It is very mountainous, and there are little valleys in between. The incoming new, loosely called Dorian tribes, clans and tribes, settle in these valley or plain spaces. A group of related clans or tribes comes in and occupies a certain valley, and the different clans or tribes settle in the form of distinct villages. A cluster of 7 or 8 or 10 or more villages that are basically all the same tribal group and which retain their connections with each other. From among these villages, through trade and commerce, one begins to emerge as a central market village, increasingly bigger than the rest, and it grows into a town, it grows into a city. It grows into a city-state. With all the other villages, now it's subordinate villages. The city-state, the city or the city-state comes to dominate that locality. This is traceable in Aristotle's Politics. Where does the term politics come from? Where does the term economics come from? There's no economics majors here, right? You have. Where does it come from? Oikos nomos.
Right.
Oikos is the Greek name for the household. Nomos is knowledge. Oikos nomos means knowledge of managing the household. It is what becomes economics. Household management. Aile ekonomisi ya da ev ekonomisi gibi bir şey. Yani başlangıçta. What about politics? It is the art of governing and managing a polis, a city-state. How to manage a household? Economics. How to manage a city-state? Politics. But there is one very interesting twist to this. Aristotle gives two meanings for the word polis. One is a fortified city. The other is a cluster of unfortified open villages. Clearly, this is the older meaning. Tek bir vadide veya ovalık alanda, düzlükte birbirine akraba klan ve kabilelerin kurdukları açık, henüz etrafları duvarlarla tahkim edilmemiş köyler topluluğu. From that, you get polis as the city-state. The city-state dominating all its satellite villages. It is a very good example of how to trace social and economic development through the changing meanings of words. But anyway, so in the Greek Dark Ages, from about 1000 to around 700 BC, this development is taking place. By 650 or so, individual Greek city-states have clearly emerged. They are going through what is called the archaic phase of ancient Greek history. And then there is a next stage, shall we say, the so-called classical age from about 480 to 323 BC. What is 323 BC? The death of Alexander. So this classical age comprises the Greek city-states and also the rise of Macedonia, the age of Philip II and Alexander the Great, and the 10 crazy years of Alexander starting from Western Anatolia, conquering all of the Persian Empire. 333 to 323, and then he dies in 323 BC, and we enter the Hellenistic age. The wars of succession, the wars of the Diadochi, veraset savaşları between Alexander's various generals, and then the rest of the Hellenistic age. Now, this is just to remind you of this overall framework. In between, what happens in 490, 480 BC? There are the Greco-Persian wars. That's to say the Persian Empire replacing the Median Empire, coming in from the east, not stopping in central Anatolia, but conquering all of Asia Minor, arriving at the Aegean Sea, and the world of the Greek city-states and Greek civilization on the other side of the Aegean, they collide. They collide, and this is the time of the Greco-Persian wars. Let's see, what about my maps? Okay, you can see it here. The blue area is once more Media, or the Median Empire, Med Imperator. These other green and pink areas are other areas of civilization and political domination in Western Anatolia that the Medians were unable to overrun. And this orange-colored area is the Neo-Babylonian or the Neo-Assyrian Empire in its last phase. What happens is, all this will be overrun by the Persian Empire, which is the biggest empire, arising in around 550. It is the biggest empire the world has seen, by far the biggest empire the world has seen until that time. And here you have a clear-cut vision of the collision between two worlds. This has become the vastness of the Persian Empire, all the way from the Indus River Valley, through Persia and the Middle East, to cover all of Anatolia and Egypt. So it seems that if you compare this with the previous maps of Greek colonization, all these Greek colonies all around the Eastern Mediterranean and Anatolia and Cyprus and the Black Sea, etc., have disappeared. They haven't disappeared. They are now subordinate to, they are inside the Persian Empire. Okay, they have been overrun by the Persian Empire, but the Persian Empire is different in civilizational quality from the Assyrian empires before it. It doesn't frequently massacre people. That is to say, it is not killing all the time. If it will be, in a way, it is like the beginning of the Roman imperial pattern. If you obey, if you remain loyal, and if you pay your taxes, it doesn't do anything to you. It is only revolts that are penalized through reprisals. But it becomes the first multicultural, multi-confessional empire, multi-identity empire, a culturally pluralistic empire of relative tolerance. Relative tolerance vis-a-vis various peoples, various ethno-linguistic groups, various identities, etc. And Rome will also follow this pattern. Look at what else is there in the year 480 BC. The Greek area is much reduced. There is here Carthage. The coastal mountains and then the Sahara. So there is no way it can expand further south. Instead, what happens is it becomes a maritime empire, basically. It builds a powerful navy, and it comes to control a lot of the Western Mediterranean until the rise of Rome. What is Carthage? Who founds? How does Carthage begin?
Phoenician colonies.
It is a Phoenician colony, the Phoenicia colony. And that is why they are called by various names resembling Phoenician. We speak of, for example, the wars between Rome and Carthage as Pön savaşları. Why Pön or Punic? Because of Phoenician, because of Phoenicia. Okay, so this is the year of the Second Great Greco-Persian War. So let me just summarize what happens, and let's take a break. The Persians launch two major expeditions against the Greek city-states. Look at this map and look at these signs of flames or fires. What happens is, late in the 6th century BC, some Greek Ionian cities revolt against Persian rule. They ask for help from the mainland, and Athens and Sparta send support. The Persians come and suppress the revolts, and they don't forget the role of Athens and Sparta. So the Greco-Persian wars that then start begin as a kind of attempted imperial punishment on the part of the Persian Empire against the Athenian and Spartan intervention. The first war, the first expedition, 490 BC. Strictly speaking, it is not an imperial expedition. In Ottoman terms, it would not be a Seferi Humayun. Instead, it is more local in character. The principal satrap, provincial governor of Western Anatolia, sends a fleet and an army into central Greece. They are targeting specifically Athens. I said they send a navy, they send a fleet. How come? Persia is a land empire. Where do they find a fleet? Where do they find a navy? You should put your finger on little questions like that, because so many times, so many people take these for granted. They don't notice that there's a problem there, actually. Look at the Eastern Mediterranean. What have they overrun? They have overrun Phoenicia. The Phoenicians have a great maritime civilization. Think of the Phoenician colonization movement. They are great shipbuilders and sailors. And Persia has incorporated the Phoenicians into its empire. And it is the Phoenicians, the Persian fleet, the Persian navy is really a Phoenician fleet or navy in the service of the Persian Empire. Does this remind you of anything about the Ottoman Empire? The Ottoman fleet, the Ottoman navy. To a considerable extent, it is a combination of pirates or corsairs. Independent pirates or corsairs, or autonomous, semi-autonomous pirates or corsairs, operating all over the Aegean and the Mediterranean. In times of imperial war, unite under the aegis, unite under the umbrella of the Ottoman Grand Admiral, join the Ottoman Navy, and fight as subordinate ship captains or squadron commanders. So many pre-modern empires are like this. That is to say, they create their military forces by recruiting from special local cultures. They have some coastal peoples who are skilled at building ships and boats and sailing them. They co-opt them and create their fleet or navy out of them. There may be other groups of people who are skilled in this or skilled in that, and they co-opt them all into their composite armed forces. We should not think of ancient armies like modern armies, all recruited by the state, subjected to a common training by the state, put in uniform by the state, provided with their equipment by the state, etc. It is very frequently not like that. They are created out of multiple optations, like what I have mentioned. Okay, so 490, first expedition. They come across the Aegean. It is possibly a force of around maybe 20,000 or so, at most, not more than that. maybe smaller. They come across the Aegean and they land at a place north of Athens called Marathon. The Persian army, they have cavalry. It's a combination of cavalry and infantry. They have horses, and it's a force out of West Asia. They have a very skilled cavalry. The Greeks don't. They have horses by that time, but they don't have a cavalry force. They are basically infantry armies. Infantry armies comprising heavily armored infantrymen fighting with iron helmets, iron breastplates, iron shields, and iron spears. They stand side by side in a formation that is called a phalanx. 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 ranks deep. And what they do is when they attack, they charge running as a phalanx, and it is the shock of hitting as a phalanx with all that momentum behind them, as I've said, 5 to 10 ranks of spearmen, that if it defeats the enemy, this is what defeats the enemy: the shock, charge, and collision. But the Greeks are afraid of course, the Persian cavalry. At Marathon, there is, if I have in space to go, the bay is like this. And there are hills here, and this is the road to Athens. The Athenian infantry army comes from Athens and comes here and blocks the entrance by felling trees and creating barricades that the Persian cavalry cannot pass. But they are afraid of venturing out to the plain because of the Persian cavalry. Out in open ground, infantry can very easily be surrounded by the much faster moving horses and can be isolated, surrounded on all sides, and cut to pieces. Over here, at the other end of the plain, some kilometers away, there's a spring. One very early morning, the Greek scout, before dawn, it brings the news that the Persian cavalry are away at the other end of the bay, at the other end of the plain, watering their horses. So the Persian infantry over here are left without any cavalry to defend them. So when the Greek forces receive this intelligence, the commander of the day, Miltiades, immediately issues orders to attack. So they come out of their fortified encampment, they blow up, they adopt their typical phalanx formation, and they attack, and they destroy the Persian infantry. And the Persian cavalry can with difficulty return, and part of them manage to be saved by their ships, and they sail away. And the Battle of Marathon is the conclusion. It's a major Greek victory, and it is the conclusion of the first Persian expedition. It gives rise to the Marathon race, because according to legend, an Athenian infantryman clad in full armor runs all the way from Marathon to Athens to bring news of victory. And this is important because they are on the verge of evacuating the city. So he brings word of victory. He says something like "we won," and then he drops and dies. And it is the same distance that has been run as the marathon race, 42 kilometers and 195 meters, something like that, ever since the 1896 Olympics. 10 years later, the Persians come again. This time, it is a Seferi Humayun. The emperor, Xerxes, is actually leading the expedition. So this time, they don't cross the Aegean, they come overland. From Western Anatolia, they cross Çanakkale Boğazı, they cross the Dardanelles. They create a pontoon bridge. In calm weather, they put all the ships of their fleet, remember the Phoenician-Persian fleet, side by side, all across the Dardanelles at its narrowest point, Sacred Bahir, the narrows, side by side, and they lay planks over them, over their bridges. So this creates a pontoon bridge, and the army and the cavalry, etc., march across on that. So they come through the northern Aegean, and they descend into Greece. They are partially stopped at the Battle of Thermopylae, but then they break through. They win a first naval victory at the Battle of Artemision. And what happens is Athens is emptied. The Greeks withdraw into the Peloponnesus, and for a few days, they take refuge in the island of Salamis. There is the Saronic Gulf, and there is Athens, and there is the island of Salamis, and there is a narrow strait passage between the mainland and the island of Salamis. There is such a congestion on the island of Salamis that they cannot stay like that for long. There's not enough food for all the allies, the Athenians, the Spartans, the infantry contingents, and the ships from all the other Greek city-states. So actually there is quite a bit of dissension within the Greek camp, and the alliance is about to break up. Themistocles is the Athenian leader. He plays one of the cleverest tricks in world history. He actually wants the Persian navy to attack. He has faith in the superior ships and seamanship of the Athenian fleet, and he believes that in a narrow space, they can crush the Persian fleet. In order to get a naval battle, he sends one of his men into the Persian camp as a double agent in order to provide false intelligence to the Persians, because he wants to make them attack immediately before the alliance breaks up. So this agent of Themistocles goes into the Persian camp, is taken before Xerxes, the Persian emperor, and he tells a tall story about the weakness of the Greeks and how they are about to break up, and now is the time to attack, basically. So Xerxes believes this story and orders the Persian fleet to attack, to enter that narrow space between the mainland and the island of Salamis, where what happens is they are trapped, and exactly as Themistocles hoped, they are destroyed by the Athenian fleet. So the Battle of Salamis, the first time the Battle of Marathon, and then the Battle of Salamis for the second expedition, becomes the turning point, because without a navy, Xerxes cannot hope to maintain his occupation of Greece, because he will not be protected from the seaside, and he cannot receive supplies from across the Aegean. So the Persian army retreats up north into the northern Aegean, and Xerxes goes back to Persia, and that is the end of the, well, I mean, in various ways from that point onwards, Greco-Persian conflicts continue here and there on a much smaller scale, but basically the major Greco-Persian wars are over, and the Greek city-states have survived. Okay. So this is actually also the turning point for the beginning of what we call the classical age. The 5th century, the late 5th century, we'll see the greatest brilliance of classical Greek, especially Athenian civilization. Okay, let's take a break. Okay, let's take a break for about 10 minutes and then continue at 3:30 for the last hour. Stopping recording. No, I don't want to. Yeah, okay. Okay, all right. So I was saying the construction of the Acropolis, the Berktay age, construction of the Acropolis, the Parthenon, the great architects like Ipnos and Kallikrates, great sculptors like Phidias and Polykleitos, the great philosophers, the pre-Socratics, Socrates, Plato, eventually a century later Aristotle, but the formation of the Greek philosophical tradition, the beginnings of history, the first citizen historians, you might say, like Herodotus and Thucydides, the great tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, potters and pottery painters like Exekias. So you have this brilliant age of cultural efflorescence in virtually all fields of culture. And then it collapses. Well, it doesn't collapse altogether, but it wanes. It wanes, so meus tutar, because of unending conflicts between the Greek city-states. Greek civilization is a world of small and many. Now, you have many different periods of small and many in human history, but what happens most of the time is from within the small and many, one unit, one city, one state, one kingdom, one political formation is able to rise and unite the rest. When I say unite, I don't necessarily mean that it happens peacefully or in nice and gentle ways. Very frequently it happens through warfare. So it is always, or almost always maybe, a question of violence and victory and defeat and domination and submission. It is an unequal relationship, but somehow it happens. In the Greek world of these small and many city-states, it never happens internally. That is to say, there is a period of the rise of Athens, and then the rise of Sparta, and then a brief period of the rise of Thebes, Thebai, but it is always very short and never conclusive, never final. That is to say, neither Athens or Sparta or Thebai managed to unite all the other Greek city-states around themselves. Instead, the fundamental loyalty of the Greek citizen remains to his city-state, not to the idea of a Hellenic world in general, not to the idea of Greekness in general, but always fundamentally loyal to this or that city-state. What then happens is, a new power arises outside this world of the Greek city-states, and it is that new power, the kingdom of Macedonia, that manages to establish authority over the Greek city-states. Macedonia is a small, forested, mountainous kingdom north of the Aegean. Well, you know where it is, from present-day Macedonia. It has come within the orbit of Greek civilization. It has absorbed Greek culture, Greek philosophy, Greek politics, the Greek mode of warfare, etc., to various degrees. And it rises to power and prominence under Philip II, and then under his son, Alexandros, who will eventually come to be known as Alexander the Great. Leave aside all the secondary details. The Greek city-states try to resist Philip II, but are eventually beaten into submission. And then when Philip dies, they initially try to resist Alexander, but again, they are forced into submission. Not very bloodily, but they are forced. And then what happens is, when Alexander launches into his career of conquest across the Aegean into the Persian Empire, all of the Greek city-states identify with him, identify with his conquest of the Persian Empire. And so you could say that in the cause of the new empire, there is no longer any resentment of Macedonia that is left. Instead, it is a combined Greek Macedonian identity that arises in the process. What kind of army does Alexander command? A combined army of Greeks and Macedonians, which eventually becomes all Greek in the sense that it becomes a Greek-speaking army. And it is this Greek-speaking army that he takes all the way through the Middle East. So there is this incredible period of conquest, just 10 years, from 333 to 323 BC. So here you have the situation at the time of his death in.
Can you share the screen? We can see.
Am I not screen? Am I not screen sharing? Oh my God! I thought I was. Okay, here we go. Okay, so if you look at this map of 323 BC, the time of his death, you see that his empire is virtually identical with the Persian Empire. This is basically what he has conquered. Three major battles: the Battle of Berktay, and then the Battle of Issos, and then the Battle of Gaugamela or Arbela, which is present-day Erbil in Iraqi Kurdistan. So, and he manages, the Granicos is virtually as soon as he crosses into Asia Minor. Issos is here, very near Antakya, and as I said, Arbela or Erbil is over here in present-day northern Iraq. Especially in the battles of Issos and Granicos, Issos and Arbela. Finally, at the Battle of Arbela, he manages to destroy the Persian army and destroy it so completely that there is no recovery. That is to say, after the Battle of Arbela, it becomes impossible for the Persian political leadership to come together yet again and gather an army, put together fresh troops to oppose Alexander again and again. At Issos and Arbela, Darius, the Persian emperor, fights two major battles, and when the Persian army is annihilated both times, there is no further resistance. There is small-scale resistance here and there, which Alexander manages to mop up. So there are several aspects to this. Number one, how does he do it? That's to say, how does he keep winning? Each and every time, the size of the Persian army is given as enormously bigger than Alexander's army. And it reaches levels of ridiculous exaggeration. First of all, there's this question of exaggeration. The Macedonian army is typically given as 30,000, 33,000, 35,000, etc. And the Persian army at Issos or Arbela is said to be, especially at Arbela, is said to be as large as 300,000. Of course, in this, there's a huge element of exaggeration by pro-Greek, pro-Macedonian orders to exaggerate Alexander's victories by making the Persian army seem impossibly large. Why is it impossibly large? Can you think logically about why in antiquity, in a simple, remember, we are not talking about the total armed forces of an empire, we are talking about the army present in one battle, a single field battle. Tek bir meydan muharebesinde mevcut ordu büyüklüğü. 300,000. How would you go about, if you were teaching high school, if you were teaching middle school, how would you demonstrate to your students that this is ridiculous? $300,000. That's what the Persian army at Arbela is reported to have been. 300,000.
This is not enough to come together.
Not close. I mean, consider.
I think it's logistically not possible. And at the time, the population of the time is not as high as today's.
Try to visualize this army of 300,000 in space. How wide is a single soldier? Let's say, I mean, consider, of course, the huge shield and the spear. So with the shield, the frontage would be about, let's say, 1 meter per soldier. If you had 300,000 soldiers side by side in a single line, how long would be the line? 300 kilometers. I mean, can you control an army stretched over 300 kilometers? Of course, let's say, not a single line, but arranged in 10 lines. So divide 300 by 10, you still get 30 kilometers. If you divide 300 by 20 lines, one after the other, you still get 15 kilometers. I mean, you would have to have 60 lines drawn up one after the other to bring it down, to bring the phalanx down to 5 kilometers. And even 5 kilometers, you cannot possibly control with ancient technology in a single battlefield. It's too long. Consider the noise of battle. Consider shields and spears and swords, metal clashing with metal, the din of battle, the screams, the yells, the shouts, the noise of the horses, all of that. And there's this tremendous din of battle, described as such by ancient authors, and 5 kilometers, and the dust rising everywhere. It is impossible to see, impossible to shout over, impossible to command, impossible to control. So, and mind you, I have assumed that you can have 60 lines, and 60 lines is just useless. Leave aside questions that you have rightfully suggested. That is to say, when you create an army of 300,000 and take it on an expedition in the days before the battle, while it is collecting and concentrating, how do you feed it? What is the, how do you manage your logistics, as Van der Mark called it? How do you supply it with provisions, etc.? This is impossible. By the way, when we look at Alexander's army size, when we look at a typical Mongol army is 3 tumans. Each tuman is 10,000 cavalrymen, so 3 tumans is around 30,000. When you look at a typical Roman legionary army, again, it is typically 2 or 3 legions, that is to say, a maximum of 30,000. Again and again, in Macedonian armies, in Mongol armies, in Roman imperial armies, you get to a figure of around 30,000. And I would like to suggest that this is no accident. In ancient times, in material conditions and circumstances prevailing in ancient times, this seems to have been the most efficient number manageable in the field. Arazide kontrol edilebilecek maksimum sayı, something around 30,000. Anything beyond that, when you get to, I'm talking about antiquity, okay? So, I'm not talking about the Middle Ages or the early modern era, etc. I'm just talking about antiquity with technology as is available in ancient history. So anything beyond 30 or 35,000 is bound to be basically useless, dysfunctional, what we would call kukalabalk. Not really effective fighting forces, but maybe just useful for psychological purposes, demonstration purposes, nothing else. Not with any real fighting value. Furthermore, all right, let's say that maybe it wasn't 300,000, but 100,000. What would have been the composition? About Alexander's army, let me say this as a kind of clue. It was all professions. All Greeks and Macedonians, as I said, speaking Greek, trained, experienced soldiers, receiving salaries, and under a single discipline, fighting under their unit commanders, and accustomed to extreme discipline and obedience. What about the Persian army? How do you get, leave aside 300,000, even an army of 100,000? Let me give you another clue. There was, in antiquity and into the Middle Ages and the early modern era, most armies had a core elite unit. Jumping fast forward, for the Ottomans, this was the Janissaries, of course, initially. But go back. I mean, this core group would always be something in the nature of a royal guards army, a soldier. Saray muhafızları olmuş. That is the meaning of the term royal guards army. The Persian Empire had an elite unit like that. They were called, in fact, the Immortals. They were infantrymen, 10,000 infantrymen. That is to say, the emperor's own private guards. They were called the Immortals because they were, whenever they had casualties, they were immediately replaced. Immortals in that sense. That's to say, the number is said to have remained constant at 10,000. Not because they did not die, but because the dead were being constantly replaced. Immortals in that sense. What about the rest? So there was this elite unit at the center, at the core of Darius's army. What about the remaining 90,000? If we can assume 100,000, what about the remaining 90,000? Who were they? What were they? You have to read Herodotus. Think socially. Think of the Persian Empire, the enormous size of the Persian Empire with all its territories and all the people living in those territories, etc.
They have cultural and language difference probably. And I don't think they are as disciplined as Alexander's army.
Well, you are moving along from the clues that I have given you, but you are not being very, very explicit, very specific. They were tribal groups. Aşiretler. Tribes living under the overall authority of the Persian Empire, kinship units with their individual hereditary reisler, chiefs or chieftains. They were not, like disciplined, organized units like divisions, regiments, battalions, etc. Böyle kümen, alay, tabur vesaire diye they don't come down to smaller units in very disciplined, strictly organized, hierarchical terms. Instead, you have a tribal chieftain and his tribal warriors, another tribal chieftain and his tribal warriors, etc. These tribal units have no further internal organization. They're just subject to their tribal leader. What happens? I mean, this army, this kind of army, how does it stay together? As long as the emperor is alive, the emperor is there on the field of battle, and all the tribal chiefs are still remaining loyal to the emperor and obeying him. If you pluck the emperor away from this kind of situation, everything falls apart. Because the individual tribal chieftain's loyalty is only and only to the emperor or the king, whatever. So, at Issos and Granicus, both times, what Alexander does is he manages to strike directly at the center of the Persian army using surprise tactics. Now, how he manages to hit the center of the Persian army is another thing. He uses very clever tactics. Let's say that the Persian army is drawn up like this, and you have the Macedonian army drawn up like this. And let's say that at the center of the Persian army is Emperor Darius in his war chariots, trying to command everything around him. At both Issos and Arbela, Alexander takes his elite cavalry and moves diagonally as if he were going to attack the left wing of the Persian army. So as he moves diagonally across the field, the left wing, part of the center and the left wing of the Persian army move further left to oppose what seems to be his direction of attack. A gap opens between the center and the left wing of the army. It is no longer a continuous front, but a gap. Halfway through his diagonal approach, Alexander suddenly turns at right angles and directly attacks the center, entering through that gap. He smashes into the center, Darius panics and flees. And then flees when the center of power and the nervous center, the command center, the loyalty center of the army turns and flees and abandons the battle, the entire Persian army falls apart. Panic sets in, and they turn and run. And this is the greatest danger for the fighting force, turning your back on the enemy and trying to escape. There are, in Turkish nationalist folklore, there are all kinds of principles and slogans and mottos about never turning your back to the enemy. This is not a matter of personal heroism. It is military wisdom. Because when you turn and run, that is when you are massacred. That is when you suffer the greatest casualties, because you are no longer fighting and resisting anymore, because your army has ceased to exist as an organized fighting force. And if they are chasing you, they just cut you down. And this is what happens to the Persian army at both Issos and Arbela. So, I mean, I'm going into all this because now or in the future, you may be likely here and there to read popular books or look into popular magazines or watch films, etc. And ponder to yourself this question of, how can this possibly be 30,000 against 300,000, etc.? First of all, it's not 300,000. And secondly, this is how it happens. Do you follow my military explanations? Thirdly, how would we compare Alexander's conquests with Roman expansion or Ottoman expansion? Roman imperial expansion and Ottoman imperial expansion are, relatively speaking, so slow and careful and always going hand in hand with construction. That's to say, building the empire, step by step, organizationally, administratively. They have a war. They win 1 or 2 battles. They conquer a piece of territory. They convert it into an eyalet or a province. They organize it. They create local military bureaucratic administration. There's a governor, a provincial governor, or maybe a Sancak Bey, or maybe a Beyler Bey. That is to say, the empire grows. As the empire grows, state administration also grows, as far as it can go. They create governorships, they create local garrisons, they create a system of tax collection, a fief distribution system, a timar system. The Ottomans, Romans don't have it. They have a cash-based state, not a fief-based state. But in any case, it doesn't happen in a flurry all at once. The Roman Empire, 264 BC, is the beginning of the First Punic War. That's to say, the first war with Carthage. The Roman Empire is built methodically over the next 300, 350 years, not in 10 years. Similarly, the Ottoman Empire. I mean, they cross over the Dardanelles to the Gallipoli Peninsula in the 1350s. They capture Edirne, probably in 1361 or 1362. It is not very clear. The first Battle of Kosovo, the Battle of Kosovo-Polje, is 1389. The Battle of Nicopolis is 1396. The capture of Constantinople is, of course, 1453, etc. I mean, İstanbul'un fethi 1453. The capture of Belgrade is 1521, 70 years later. And the Battle of Mohacs is 1526, and so on and so forth. So just from crossing over into the Gallipoli Peninsula, let's say 1354, probably, to the Battle of Mohacs is 200 years. Bit by bit, conquest, consolidation, conquest, consolidation, conquest, consolidation. Alexander's conquest is not like that. It's all over in 10 years. He doesn't have time to consolidate. I mean, he takes this very elite professional army, this elite fighting force of, let's say, 35,000, or maybe at most 40,000 or so, in through one end of the Persian Empire, and he emerges out at the other end, defeating everything in his path. Haydutya, he's like a top bandit or brigand or pirate of some kind. He's unlike the Roman consuls or unlike Ottoman sultans. He's like pure conqueror, or shall we say pure violence. Pure violence. Of course, he's a fascinating character. He's a great mystery. He's a great puzzle. He's also very violent in his relations with his even closest companions. He gets drunk, he picks fights, and he kills some of his closest generals at banquet arguments. He loses himself. He has this ferocious temper, and it just explodes. And the next morning, maybe he wakes up and he's got a hangover and he gets over it. But then he's full of regrets because the dead do not come back. But this happens frequently. He's like a whirlwind, bayağı böyle bir fırtına that just passes in 10 years through all of the Middle East. And when he dies, there's no family, there's no dynasty, he has no clear-cut successor. There's only his army and his generals. I'm trying to understand Alexander. So what happens when he dies is there arise wars of succession, referred to as wars of the Diadochi, wars between his generals about who controls what or who takes what. Eventually, there arises a certain partitioning of Alexander's empire. There is the home kingdom of Macedonia, which remains small. Two major sub-empires arise. The Seleucids, Selevkiler in Turkish, and the Ptolemaids in Egypt, Ptolemaios ya da Batlamyus hanedan. Seleucus is one of his leading generals. He manages to grab most of Persia and the Middle East and even part of Anatolia initially. Ptolemaios establishes himself in Egypt, and there arise smaller units in between these two units or in parts of Western Asia Minor that sometimes break away, sometimes coalesce again, etc. In history, in teaching history, teaching about the Hellenistic age, its political units, its political history, may be the single most difficult subject. Because there is no cohesion to it, there is no unity to it, and because there is such scattering or fragmentation of power, there are so many diverse political units whose fates seem to be so uncertain, fighting against each other, rising and falling in the same historical space of the Middle East. There is one thing common among them. They are all Greek-speaking dynasties that consider themselves to be Greek, imposed on lands, imposed on territories that don't have a Greek population. So in political science terms, these are not organic states. In history, historical sociology, and political science, when we use the term organic state, it means a cultural, ethno-linguistic, strong identity relationship between a people and the state sitting on top of it. The Seljuks are an organic state. The Germanic kingdoms are organic states. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in England are organic states. Virtually all states in medieval Europe are organic states. That is to say, in terms of the subject population and the royalty, the monarchy sitting on top of them, there is a unity in terms of ethnic origins, language, and religion. The Hellenistic kingdoms are not organic states. Rather, they are what we might call Praetorian states. You might remember this term, maybe again from SPS last year. The Praetorian Guard are Roman imperial guards. Late in its history, the Roman Empire comes to be divided into two, East and West, and both East and West, within themselves, come to be further divided into two administrative units. And a higher rank of officials in administering these territories are called praetors. A Praetorian Guard is an elite guard unit that protects a praetor. What happens when the Praetorian Guard carries out a coup d'etat, bir hükümet darbesi, and seizes power for itself? You get what is called a Praetorian state. Muhafız ordusunun ya da hassa ordusunun darbesiyle oluşan bir devlet tipi. Bir çeşit hassa ordusu diktatörlüğü. Okay? And typically in these situations, you have a dislocation between the state that forms and the people beneath it. You have a disconnection. There is no ethnic, linguistic, cultural, religious, etc. unity. After the rise of Islam and the conversion of the Turks, the Oghuz tribes of Mavera Nehir, of Transoxania to Islam, some of the first Turkish Islamic states that arise are Praetorian states. The Samanids are a Praetorian state, and the Ghaznavids, which rise out of the Samanids, are again a Praetorian state. You have a certain geographically located population, and there is a dynast, a sultan, a king of some sort, who has come in with his linguistically and culturally alien army and is ruling over that society. The Hellenistic kingdoms are all like this. You have the people of Egypt, you have the native people of Egypt, and you have a Greek-speaking dynasty sitting on top of them. So first, there is this basic pattern, and then within this basic pattern, cracks appear. For example, I'm trying to speak in terms of abstract models, and then you can read the details, okay? You have the Seleucid Empire, Selevki Krallığı veya İmparatorluğu, and there's a provincial governor somewhere in Bactria, let's say. And then the local tribes ally among themselves and overthrow this governor, this Seleucid governor, and establish their own dynasty. So you have a small, a regional Bactrian empire, shall we say, arising within the overall integument of the Seleucid Empire. It is a new tribal confederation type of unit, but it has absorbed Greek Macedonian culture. So you get these cultural hybrids. It becomes a world in which you have the original Praetorian states and their descendants, and they start breaking up into smaller and smaller units. You have semi-tribal units arising within this overall framework and overthrowing centrally appointed governors and replacing them and taking over local power for themselves. For about from 323 for the next 200 years or so, it is this kind of jungle. They are, how shall I say, they are trapped by this geography. Everything is happening within this geography, within what you see here, what you previously saw as the Persian Empire, what you see here as the Empire of Alexander. Note that it isn't even called the Macedonian Empire, it is the Empire of Alexander. And its lifetime coincides entirely with Alexander. It is an individual product. It is no accident that it is known as Alexander's Empire, because it rises with Alexander and it is partitioned, it breaks up with the death of Alexander. Probably there has been no other empire in history that rises so quickly and is so entirely dependent on a single personal war leader and conqueror. And his career becomes the lifetime of the empire. So into this world, who comes next? Rome. You have this Hellenistic world continuing for nearly, 200 years, 190 years or so. And in the meantime, and I shall do this next time, just envisage this process. A group of tribes, yet another branch of the Indo-European peoples, have come down into Italy from the north. These are the Italic peoples, and they give the name Italy to that peninsula. Included, there are so many tribes and tribal languages involved. We will see separate maps for that. But one actually initially small group amongst these Italic peoples are the Latins or the Latin speakers. It is one language among many Italic languages which are part of the Indo-European languages. So these Latins settle in initially a small corner of Italy that comes to be known as Latium. As with the Greek Dark Ages, they establish a series of related villages connected with each other, and one among these grows up to be the city and the city state of Rome, initially ruling just over Latium. The next phase, conquering, subjugating, or by alliance peacefully unifying all of Italy. The unification of Italy. First, Latium, and then all Italy. If you want to think comparatively in terms of Anatolian Ottoman terms, you have a number of Turkoman principalities in Anatolia. Only one among them is something called the House of Osman, the Ottoman Principality, and it will grow to unify partially the western part of Anatolia before it jumps into Rumelia. back to Rome, first Italy, and then the Western Mediterranean. And for supremacy in the Western Mediterranean, it comes to fight against Carthage. So look at this map in front of you. You have, this is 323 BC. So in Italy, you have two white spots. You have the Etruscans and you have Rome. Rome, by then, has become independent of the Etruscans, and it will come to unify all of Italy. But look, Carthage, at the time, is ruling about 3/4 of the Western Mediterranean. So this leads into the Punic Wars, the Roman-Carthaginian confrontation, or controlling the Western Mediterranean. The First Punic War, 264 to 241 BC. Basically Roman victory. Rome pushes Carthage back, and the Western Mediterranean, Bakbatini Savzası, comes to be shared kind of half and half between Rome and Carthage. The Second Punic War, the most famous of all, 218 BC to 202 BC. This is Hannibal's war. That's to say, Hannibal, from the Barca family, Carthaginian nobility, takes an elite Carthaginian army through Spain and through France and through the Alps, and comes into Italy from the north, catching Rome completely by surprise, and then wins 3 major battles against the Roman armies sent up to face him, the most catastrophic of which is the Battle of Cannae. But all this happens only in his first 2 years in Italy. And then the Romans learn. The Romans learn that they don't want to face up to Hannibal in an open field battle. He's too good. So what they do is, from that moment onward, they stay away. They don't give him open battle, but they limit his movements, and they practice a war of attrition against him. Hannibal has been hoping that Rome's allies will rise up against Rome and join him. This doesn't happen. So he continues in Italy for another 12 or 13 years, finds the situation hopeless, and somehow manages to escape back to North Africa. There, he is finally defeated by the army of Scipio Africanus in the Battle of Zama. And so Carthage loses the Second Punic War and is limited to just a declining city. And Rome wins the entire Western Mediterranean. After that, Rome begins gradually expanding into the Northern Balkans, coming down into the Balkans, conquering Greece, and crossing the Aegean to enter Anatolia. 135 BC is taken as the decisive entry of Rome into Asia Minor and the absolute end of the Hellenistic age, because Rome has decisively arrived. 136, 135 BC is when the entire kingdom of Pergamon, from the city of Pergamon in the north to Ephesus in the south, that entire kingdom of Pergamon is turned over to Roman rule. And that is like the symbolic demarcation date for the end of the Hellenistic age and the arrival of the Roman Empire in Anatolia and in the Middle East. Okay, so I have given you a synopsis of what is to come. I will resume with that story in greater detail and take it through the Roman Empire into the Middle Ages, the beginning of the Middle Ages, and the rise of the medieval pattern of the peopling of Europe. Okay? Any questions?
When will we have a midterm?
Midterm? What's a midterm?
Let's not hear it again.
Huh?
Let's not hear it.
We will have a midterm. As I've said previously, I mean, it is nominally called midterm, but let's call it the first exam. We're in week 9. Let's say probably week 11. Week 11 or week 12, okay? So I want to have finished the peopling of Europe, the peopling and the languages of Europe at least, okay? So that there is some substance as to what I can ask, okay? Okay. I've overstepped by 15 minutes. All right, thank you. And we will be finishing the peopling of Europe next time. And as in the week after that, what I will do is, as an outcome of the peopling of Europe, I will do the languages of Europe in a single class session, okay? Because languages is what comes out of peopling, okay?
Thank you.